All right, so we're diving into existentialism today. Got some really interesting excerpts from How to Be an Existentialist by Gary Cox.
Oh, yeah, that's a great book.
It is. And, when you hear philosophy, you might think, oh, this is going to be heavy, but this is really about, how to live a more meaningful life.
Exactly.
It's about you. So, we'll be looking at questions like, what does it mean to be truly free? And how do I find meaning when sometimes the world just feels absurd?
Right. Big questions.
Yeah, big questions.
Yeah.
And how can I, just live more authentically? And
Mm.
to help us unpack all of this is our expert. They're going to break down these core concepts of existentialism and show us how to actually apply them to our everyday lives. So
Mm.
I know you're already familiar with the basics, so no need for existentialism 101 here.
Right into the deep end.
Yeah, right into the deep end. Let's jump into one of the most famous existentialist ideas. Existence precedes essence.
Hmm.
It's a Sartre quote. It
Yeah.
could sound a little cryptic, so can
Yeah.
you help us unpack that?
Sure. Well, it kind of flips the traditional script, right? Like instead of us being born with a predefined purpose or an essence, almost like a blueprint for our lives, existentialism says we come into this world as a blank slate.
Okay.
We exist first, and then through our choices and actions, we actually create our own essence.
So it's not that like we're born to be a doctor or a lawyer or an artist, is that we become those things through the choices that we make.
Exactly. Cox actually uses a really powerful analogy in the book. He talks about an artisan who starts with a simple piece of clay.
Okay.
And the clay itself has no inherent form or function, right? But through the artisan's skill, intention, and effort, it can be molded into a beautiful vase, a sturdy bowl, even a whimsical sculpture.
Right.
And in the same way, our lives are shaped by the choices we make and the actions we take.
Wow. That's a great visual.
Yeah.
But I can imagine this radical freedom could also feel a bit daunting. If there's no preset path, no blueprint to follow, doesn't that put a ton of pressure on us to make the quote unquote right choices?
Absolutely. And that's where responsibility comes in. Existentialism doesn't shy away from the weight of our choices. In fact, it sees responsibility as an integral part of freedom. If we're truly free to choose our path, then we also have to own the consequences of those choices.
So it's not just about freedom to choose, but also the freedom to screw up.
Exactly. And that can be scary, but it can also be incredibly empowering. Cox actually talks about this in the context of career choices. Let's say you've been working in a job you hate for years. You might feel stuck, like you have no other options. But from an existentialist perspective, you always have a choice. You can choose to stay in that job, or you can choose to take a risk and pursue something that aligns more with your values and aspirations.
I can see how that could be liberating, but also terrifying. What if you make the, air quotes, the wrong choice? What if you take a risk and it doesn't work out?
Right. And that's a valid concern, and it's something Cox addresses directly. He argues that there's no such thing as a wrong choice in the absolute sense. Every choice we make shapes who we become and leads us down a particular path. Some paths might be more challenging than others, but each one offers opportunities for learning, growth, and even redirection.
So it's not about making the right choice. It's about making a choice that feels authentic to you and being willing to learn and adapt along the way.
Yeah, I think that's a good way to put it.
Okay, that's helpful. But how do we know what feels truly authentic? How do we avoid falling into the trap of what Sartre called bad faith?
Bad faith. It's a fascinating concept that gets to the heart of what it means to live authentically. Cox actually shares a really striking anecdote from the book that illustrates this perfectly.
Oh, I'm all ears for a good anecdote.
Okay, so Cox describes a waiter who is incredibly good at his job. He's charming, attentive, and knows how to anticipate the needs of his customers. But deep down, he despises the work. He dreams of being a writer, but he's too afraid to quit his secure job and pursue his passion. So he goes through the motions, playing the role of the perfect waiter while suppressing his true desires.
Wow, that's so relatable. I think we've all felt that dissonance at some point in our life, that feeling of playing a role that doesn't quite fit, of conforming to expectations that aren't truly our own.
Exactly. And that's the essence of bad faith. It's when we deny our own freedom and responsibility by pretending we have no choice, by conforming to societal expectations, or simply taking the path of least resistance.
But isn't it a bit naive to think we have total freedom? I mean, what about societal constraints, financial pressures, family obligations? I mean, those things can feel very real and very limiting.
You're absolutely right. It would be unrealistic to say we're free from all constraints. But even within those limitations, we still have a degree of choice. We can choose how we respond to those pressures, how we interpret those limitations, and how we prioritize our values and desires.
So it's not about ignoring those external realities. It's about acknowledging them and then um, making choices that are as aligned with our true selves as possible, even within those constraints.
Precisely. It's about asking ourselves, am I making this choice because it's truly what I want? Or am I simply choosing the path that feels safest or most comfortable?
Right.
You know?
Yeah, I can see how that could be a really powerful exercise in self-reflection. But it also seems like it could be a slippery slope. How do we know if we're being truly authentic or if we're just like rationalizing our choices to
Yeah.
make ourselves feel better?
That's a great question, and it's something Cox explores in depth. He argues that living authentically isn't about achieving some perfect state of self-knowledge or always making the right choices. It's about a commitment to ongoing self-reflection, to constantly questioning our motivations, and to being open to course correcting when we realize we veered off track.
So it's not about reaching some final destination of authenticity. It's about the journey itself, the process of constantly checking in with ourselves and making sure our choices are aligned with our values and aspirations.
Exactly. It's about embracing the messiness and complexity of being human and recognizing that authenticity is an ongoing process, not a fixed state of being.
Wow, this is giving me a lot to think about. But before we go any further down this rabbit hole, maybe it's time to shift gears a bit.
Okay.
We've talked about freedom, responsibility, and authenticity.
Yeah.
But what about the big existential question of meaning? How do we find meaning in a world that often feels absurd and unpredictable?
That's where things get really interesting.
Right, I'm ready for it.
Yeah.
Let's dive in. Okay, so we've been talking about, freedom and responsibility and authenticity, all these weighty existential themes. But now let's turn to the big question that probably keeps a lot of us up at night. How do we find meaning in a world that sometimes feels completely absurd?
Right. It's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
It is.
And existentialism, rather than, shying away from this feeling of absurdity, it actually leans right into it.
Okay. But how does leaning into absurdity help us find meaning? Wouldn't that just make us feel more lost, more nihilistic?
Yeah, I mean, it might seem counterintuitive, but Cox, he makes a compelling argument here. He says that recognizing the absurdity of existence, the fact that there's no like inherent meaning or grand plan, can actually be incredibly liberating. Think about it. If there's no predetermined script, then you're free to write your own.
So instead of searching for meaning out there like some cosmic puzzle piece,
Yeah.
we need to we're empowered to create our own meaning.
Exactly. And that's where things get really exciting. Cox, he provides a bunch of examples in the book of how people have created meaning in their lives, even in the face of absurdity.
Okay.
For some, it's through creative pursuits like writing, painting, or music. For others, it's through deep connections with others, building loving relationships, or contributing to their communities.
So it's not about finding some grand universal meaning. It's about finding what personally resonates with you and building a life around that.
Yeah, precisely. And the beauty of it is that meaning can be found in the seemingly mundane as well.
Right.
Cox, he talks about, a baker who finds immense satisfaction in perfecting a sourdough recipe, or a gardener who feels this deep sense of connection to nature through tending to their plants.
Right.
It's about finding what lights you up, what makes you feel truly alive, and pursuing it wholeheartedly.
When I first started reading about existentialism, I have to admit I was a bit intimidated by all this talk about angst and despair. But hearing you talk about it actually feels kind of hopeful.
Yeah, I get that. Existentialism is often portrayed as this dark and brooding philosophy, but I think that's a misinterpretation. Yes, it acknowledges the difficult truths about existence, the lack of inherent meaning, the inevitability of death, the weight of our freedom, but it also offers a profoundly empowering message. You're not a passive passenger in this absurd journey called life. You have the power to create your own meaning, to forge your own path, to live authentically.
That brings us back to the idea of existential angst, which we touched on earlier. Cox talks about it being a natural response to realizing the weight of our freedom. So how do we navigate that angst? How do we avoid getting overwhelmed by the sheer vastness of possibilities?
Well, Cox argues that angst isn't something to be, uh, feared or suppressed. It's a signal that you're truly grappling with the big questions, that you're awake to the possibilities and the responsibilities that come with your freedom.
So instead of running away from the angst, we should lean into it.
Exactly. And Cox, he provides some really practical strategies for doing that. He talks about the importance of finding meaningful projects that give you a sense of purpose and direction.
Okay, so what kind of meaningful projects are we talking about here? Does it have to be something grand and world changing, or could it be something smaller, more personal?
It can absolutely do something personal. What matters is that it resonates with you, that it aligns with your values and passions. It could be anything from writing a novel to learning a new language to volunteering in your community.
I'm starting to think that existentialism isn't just a philosophy. It's like a call to action.
I love that way of putting it. It's a call uh, to wake up to the possibilities of your existence, to embrace your freedom and responsibility, and to actively create a life that feels meaningful to you, even in a world that often feels absurd.
I'm feeling really inspired by this conversation. But before we get too carried away with all this meaning making, maybe we should shift gears a bit and talk about some concrete steps we can take to put these existentialist principles into practice. After all, it's one thing to talk about freedom and responsibility. It's another thing to actually live it.
Absolutely. In the next part of our deep dive, we'll explore some actionable strategies from Cox's book for incorporating existentialist principles into our daily lives. We'll talk about things like mindful decision making, cultivating self-awareness, and finding meaning through action.
That sounds like exactly what I need. Can't wait to hear more. Okay, so let's wrap up this existentialism deep dive by getting practical. We've explored these heady concepts, the freedom, the responsibility, uh, the absurdity of it all. But how do we, actually weave these ideas into our everyday lives?
Yeah, that's where the rubber meets the road, right?
It is.
And Cox doesn't disappoint. He offers a bunch of really actionable steps into how to be an existentialist.
Okay, so no need to quit our jobs and run off to a monastery in Tibet.
Not unless that's what truly resonates with you. But you're right. Cox's approach is much more about subtle shifts in perspective and daily choices rather than some radical life overhaul.
I like the sound of that. Give me those baby steps.
Okay, well, he starts with the idea of mindful decision making.
Okay.
Remember, existentialism is all about radical freedom, meaning we have this vast array of choices in front of us at any given moment. But how often do we just operate on autopilot? Making choices out of habit, societal pressure, or just plain fear.
Oh, guilty as charged. I'm the queen of autopilot sometimes.
Yeah, it happens to the best of us. But Cox, he encourages us to hit that pause button before making a decision, even seemingly small ones. Ask yourself, why am I choosing this? Is this truly what I want, or am I just following the path of least resistance?
So it's about bringing, conscious awareness to those everyday choices we often make without even thinking.
Exactly. And by doing that, we start to reclaim our freedom and take ownership of the direction our lives are heading.
That makes me think about another concept that Cox talks about, cultivating self-awareness.
Right.
He argues that to live authentically, we need to really understand our values, our beliefs, and our motivations.
Yeah, it's like getting to know the deepest parts of ourselves, right? Going beyond those roles and expectations that society tries to impose on us. Cox suggests practices like, journaling, meditation, or even just taking quiet time for reflection.
So it's about creating space in our busy lives to actually listen to that inner voice.
Exactly. And as we become more self-aware, we're better equipped to make choices that align with our authentic selves rather than just, conforming to external pressures.
Okay, mindful decision making, self-awareness. These are great starting points. What else does Cox have in his toolkit for putting existentialism into action?
Well, he also emphasizes the importance of finding meaning through action and engagement with the world.
Okay.
Remember, existentialism acknowledges the absurdity of life, but it also empowers us to create our own meaning.
So it's not about passively accepting that life is meaningless. It's about actively creating a life that feels meaningful to us.
You got it. And Cox says we can do this by pursuing our passions, nurturing our relationships, contributing to causes we believe in, or simply engaging with the world in a way that feels authentic and purposeful.
I'm starting to see a theme here. It all comes back to that idea of
Yeah.
taking ownership, right?
Yeah.
We're not just passive bystanders. We're active participants in creating our own lives.
Exactly. And that's a really empowering perspective. It reminds us that even in a world that often feels chaotic and unpredictable, we have the freedom to shape our own destinies.
I have to say, this deep dive has been a real eye-opener for me. I came in thinking existentialism was all doom and gloom, but I'm walking away feeling incredibly energized and optimistic.
That's fantastic to hear. It's been a real pleasure exploring these ideas with you.
Well, a huge thank you to our expert for all the insightful analysis, and to you, dear listener, thanks for joining us on this journey into the world of existentialism. If you're as intrigued as I am, we highly recommend checking out How to Be an Existentialist by Gary Cox. It's a thought-provoking and surprisingly practical guide to living a more authentic and meaningful life. And as we sign off, we'd like to leave you with a question to ponder. What is one area of your life where you could embrace more freedom and authenticity? We encourage you to reflect on that and see where it leads you. Until next time, keep diving deep and keep exploring those big questions that make life so fascinating.